Are you stuck in the same old routine at work? Do you find yourself hitting a creative wall, unable to see beyond your current perspective? It's time to break free and unlock the power of fresh perspectives. David Gouthro. No surprise, I do these all the time, and I'm here with Discover Fresh Perspectives. And today I have as my guest Jim Moller. Welcome, Jim.
Thank you for having me.
So, Jim, before we get into talking something you're interested about, I noticed that behind your name you have the initial CPHR, and I'm sure there's a lot of people listening that might have seen that before but don't know what it is. Can you just say for a moment what that is, and that'll also give us a sense a little bit about what kinds of things are important to you?
I'm a certified professional in human resources. I've been under the association since 2019, but
Oh,
I've actually been in human resources and labor relations for almost 20 years, the
oh,
majority of
wow.
my career.
Mhm. Okay, so now anyone out there listening, when you hear that, that's what the CPHR is. It means people have invested some time and effort and energy into to learning of things of human resource nature. So, Jim, I was just looking at some of the things I know you've written a couple of books, and one of the things that caught my attention, you had a phrase that said, and please correct me if I get this wrong, but oftentimes systems collapse before they fail. Did I get that right?
That's correct. You know, Organizations don't fail overnight. They usually slowly erode over time. Uh, you know, a lot of smart people are still very human, but organizations don't usually fail because people are incompetent. They fail because people adapt, they compensate. Those small problems become normal. The workarounds become routine. Delays become acceptable. And over time, everyone just adjusts to conditions that, have seemed unacceptable for years earlier. And so that tolerance, that normalization, basically erodes the real structure of an organization. Aside from those formal policies or work plans, and eventually something major happens, and the leaders are questioned by their governance. Why did this happen? How did this happen so quickly? And again, it's been over time where people have just adjusted to these conditions.
So, I'm not sure how good a metaphor this is, but what occurs to me is that people with, from our health of our own body perspective, things start to hurt a little bit. So you compensate, you lean a little bit to the left, lean a little bit to the right. And then at some point, it gets to the point where you are almost incapacitated. You end up going to a chiropractor and he or she points out, this has been building over years. As you've done kind of like what you described, we compensate, don't pay attention to these things, tend to normalize a certain level of dysfunction until boom, something hits us and all of a sudden it becomes like a major issue. Is that a fair comparison?
Absolutely. I relate the quiet collapse to not only organizations, but to people too and ourselves. From the outside, we might be seen as very successful and always bringing projects to fruition and close and always being there to help others. But a lot of people don't realize that you might be suffering. You might be delaying your own self care because you're so busy. You might say, hey, I'll deal with myself next week or after this next deadline or after I help this person. And over time, that that time never comes. So you learn to not even trust yourself. And again, when we relate this to organizations, most leaders wait too long to act because most warning signs arrive as ambiguity rather than certainty. Um, Leaders are constantly balancing competing priorities, just like we are as in our personal lives and incomplete information. And so, that ache and that pain that, okay, it'll just go away on its own. And we really don't take care of that underlying issue. requires an appointment with a physician or sometimes even an ER because you've injured yourself past the point of being able to do it on your own. So the challenge is that by the time certainty arrives, that opportunity for easy correction is often past.
So so these things happen, so you talked a little bit about why they happen because people, they don't deal with ambiguity, set it aside until there's clarity. Are there other reasons why that you've seen happen in organizations where, there's almost like a willful blindness or something? What contributes to these things?
I think, initially, employees who have a good heart and very interested in the fiduciary duty of their organization will raise their hand and say, "Hey, this system's not working properly, or we have this problem." And over time, they'll raise it to their supervisor or manager, and nothing is done. So again, people slowly start to refrain from speaking up honestly about what is happening. A leader or a manager will basically say, "Hey, you're overreacting," or "It's not a big deal right now." Or again, we'll defer that and say, "Hey, we'll wait until next month to see if it's self corrected." And so over time, people stop speaking up, and managers, they're not hearing these concerns anymore. And so they figure everything is running well. As I said earlier, most leaders focus on the visible performance indicators such as, revenue, budgets, productivity, turnover, project completion. Those are all important, but they're lagging indicators. The more important questions are often beneath the surface. As I said, are people actually speaking up honestly? Are concerns being raised? Are those concerns being addressed? Are difficult conversations happening? Those conditions determine what future performance will actually look like.
So, Jim, what's your sense of why managers ignore this? Like, I can imagine there's probably a number of reasons, but do you have, like, some of the big ones? So one of the things I wonder if sometimes people ignore things that it's actually because of a fear that they're going to have to do something with it, but they rationalize it some other way. So what sort of inhibits what either systemically or personally or interpersonally prevent managers and supervisors from wanting to pay attention to the very things that are signaling a possible collapse if they don't actually address it?
Uh, Again, as I had mentioned earlier, a lot of leaders are looking for that certainty, not the ambiguity. And so they want to be certain before they have that difficult conversation or they raise a concern to their board because again, they want to provide that data, that information. I think the real problem with today's leadership is the pace of change in technology. Organizations are dealing with technological disruption and workforce transformations and political polarization. There's economic uncertainty. Our Canadian government just announced that we might be in a recession right now.
Right.
And again, the growing complexity, all happening simultaneously. The temptation is to focus entirely on speed. My real concern is that organizations might sacrifice that reflection, the judgment, and that human connection in pursuit of constant movement.
Well, that's certainly that reflection time is something that's so important that I don't think we honor. Like I've heard people talk about, they were sitting at their desk working away, and then they were just sitting and thinking about something, and their manager came by and said, "What are you doing?" And the response is, "Well, I'm thinking." You don't have time to think, get back to work. And I just think of like the craziness and the danger of that. So what are some early warning signs? So describing the fact that this collapse is happening. So how do you prevent it? What are some things that you can see are happening, and what are some the possibilities for early intervention so that perhaps you can address it sooner or with less pain or loss?
I really think that it is more than just a leadership, but it's a system. It's a culture that's been created or allowed to continue over time. But again, if I had advice for experienced leaders out there, it would be to stay curious. You
Mm,
know,
mm.
that experience is valuable, but it can also create blind spots. So, you know, asking those questions, continuing challenging your assumptions, keep looking for signals that others might dismiss. Again, it's more about having those check-ins, not necessarily on the objectives or the tasks that an employee might have, but hey, Fred, how's your week been? Is everything going well? Or are you having to compromise on any of the projects? Can I support you in any way? You know, being there, understanding, listening, and supporting the employees, I think is the key behind a lot of this.
So focusing on higher raising the priority of focus on the person, rather than the task. I mean, they're both important, but it seems like people do not take the time to do that, to exercise curiosity, to have those check-ins, and it's one of those things that I find, when it hasn't been done, people are able to look back and say, "Oh, I wish I'd really taken the time to do this." Right? Because you can see the cost of that, but, how do you sell people on the value proactively of doing it when there's no guarantee there's gonna be a positive, impact of that? But, at some level, if we don't, we're gonna be in trouble. Like, how do you get managers to prioritize their time to do what you just said, which I think is absolutely critical? What's the case to be made?
I think those senior leaders need to lead by example. Do that with their direct reports, their
Mhm.
managers, and encourage them to have those discussions with their direct reports. But again, as a senior leader, I don't just reach out to my direct reports. I'll reach out to everyone within the organization just to get a temperature feel, kind of like where are we right now. I really believe that people are the foundation of a successful organization. When we lead with a people first approach, uh, people will take care of our business. Whereas, I've seen over time, over and over again, senior leaders will only focus on the bottom line, that net operating income. And again, sometimes they forget about the people and they wonder why the attrition rates are through the roof and, their employee engagement is down and why nobody is speaking up because, they've never been recognized as an
Mhm.
asset. They're more considered a liability.
No, I could think way back when working with a steel company back in Ontario, one of the phrases, the marketing phrases are, "Our product is steel, our strength is people." And then you talk to some of the people in that organization and say, "I don't really feel I'm being treated that way." Right? Or some of these, 50 best employers, 20 best employers, whatever, all these different things going on that seem to be an indication that people are important. And then you talk to people in the organization and it's kind of like, I don't know who filled that out, but it wasn't me. So the people focus is used to attract people, but then there's not enough attention once people get in. And quite frankly, it's usually the good ones that leave because they see the gap between what, the people say it's important, the way I actually feel treated.
I've seen so many employee surveys being done well and so many being done poorly. It's really nice to have that consistent engagement survey be done every year. But if you don't action some of the items, if you don't provide that necessary feedback to the employees, your engagement scores will decline over time. People will be uh,
They get
less
cynical.
open to, questioning what is happening or raising concerns through those s- i- surveys. So again, when you're not actioning or providing that feedback, it can be a detriment to employee engagement. I've been in labor relations for almost 2 decades now, and I've handled a number of investigations and grievances. And the funny thing is, Dave, a lot of these grievances aren't necessarily about an article within the collective agreement. It's how employees were made to feel during the matter at hand.
So, Jimmy, a couple of things. One, you said that you've seen some companies do it really well around these surveys, and you've probably seen some companies that have avoided the collapse or dealt with it. Can you describe what some of the ones? don't want to say best practices because that's so variable, but some exemplars of people that seem to be, if you look at the basic principles of what these folks are doing, there's some really good learning here. So, either about the surveys, but also, how they've avoided or dealt with that collapse. So, give people some hope that there's something could be done about it.
Looking back, I think some of the most important lessons that I've learned, the biggest lesson is that leadership is never neutral. Leaders shape that environment that people work
Mm,
in every day. They influence trust, confidence, engagement, and their performance. I've also learned that organizations rarely fail because of a lack of intelligence, as I had mentioned. More often, they fail because reality becomes difficult to see, difficult to discuss,
mm,
or difficult to challenge. I really believe that. Especially in the day of AI technology, everything is moving so quickly that we think that we have the guardrails in place to protect our clients' privacy or even our personal or even organizational secrets. But again, we've allowed machine continuation without an opportunity to challenge whether or not that model is correct or not. And sometimes we don't want to stop something that's in motion because we might be wrong. Again,
right.
not having that certainty. So, in this day and age, we need to be vetting a lot of these technologies.
Yeah, well, and I see, in some organizations that if you do that, if you ask those questions, say, "Oh, you're a Luddite, you're against change," and things like that. So they don't even allow space for the conversation, right? Just totally shut it down. And this whole thing about people being engaged and having those conversations. I do a fair bit of work hosting town halls. And one of my objections to the way a lot of town halls are run is it tends to be, in many of the cases, one way. So, here's the senior management team talking about these are the things that we're going to do, which is, a waste of time, a waste of money, abuse of intellectual capital of the people in the room. And I was working with one organization where, to his credit, the CEO said, "I want to know what people think about these things." So it was highly interactive, and he created the space for if there's something that people didn't like, he was just able to stand metaphorically in the fire and just hear it and not have to defend and respond and yada yada yada, but really hear it, say, yes, that's a great point. We have to look into that. So people actually felt that their voice was heard, and it wasn't just lip service. Here's the town hall. We're doing you the service of letting you know what we're doing, which could be done in an email and spend a whole lot less money and have probably the same effect. So, but it's for a leader to be willing to be, open to hearing what people have to say and not get defensive about it because who knows? No one knows all the right things to do. Used to be the higher up you went in an organization, you got there because you had more experience, things were predictable, you knew more than other people. Now it's just not the case. You can't possibly know that. And how do you capture all the value of what people have to bring in your organization?
I really feel that there's a big disconnect with a lot of senior leaders today from the people that are actually doing the work, front facing with their customers, working with the tools and the policies. I feel sorry for middle managers. They're
Yeah.
directed by senior leadership to fundamentally change how those people work. And there's no real engagement on what is the feedback, what are the consequences of changing what we're doing now. And so, those middle managers are in a hard place because they're hearing it from above and they're also hearing it from below. I've always really uh, involved people from all parts of that hierarchy of an org chart because those people that are closest to the systems and the processes and the people, those are the ones more inclined to provide innovation and change. So, again, as leaders, we need to ask, what are we not seeing? What concerns are not reaching my table? Where are we relying on assumptions rather than evidence? What risks appear manageable today that could become significant tomorrow? And by asking these difficult questions and beginning these conversations, we can hopefully affect change within the organization and not reach a crisis point or an event where we have to explain ourselves to a governance board.
Oh, yeah. So, you know, there was, I'm just trying to think. So there was one organization that I was working with. To your point, it was an oil company many years ago, and they wanted to get input on something. So what they did is they sent out a sort of an open request throughout the organization to say, "This is the issue we're talking about. We want a diagonal slice through the whole organization. We want people to come here with all those different opinions, and we want those opinions to be heard based on the quality of the idea, not who says it, not because this person up here said it, so it's therefore more important than someone who's right in touch with the organization." It was great having that. Another CEO client of mine lives this in the organization. His principle is nothing for me without me. So, you know, don't be doing things for the people on the front line of the technology without engaging them first. You know, we tend to be, I'm doing this for you. Or we see it a lot of times with First Nations. We're going to do this for you, which drives them crazy to do something for me. Like, you know better about my situation than I do. Give me a break. And it's, you know, creating the spaces for those conversations. And my experience has been that conversations change nothing, but every change begins with a conversation. That's the starting point to gather that. Have you seen companies that do that particularly well, Jim? We don't need to name the company, but maybe the practices that they've embraced that you've seen have really positive consequence.
I think it comes down to having strong engagement, reaching out to everyone across the organization, asking them questions, not necessarily speaking to them about this is what we're going to do. Even if a leader has an answer,
Mm,
they should be asking their direct reports. I have this problem, this issue, this concern. What would you do?
mm,
How would you solve this? And just empowering people to take accountability and ownership for this can really elevate their performance within the organization, make them feel recognized, make them feel heard. You know, I think courage is one of the most underrated leadership capabilities,
yeah.
you know, and again, it's empowering others to be courageous, everyday courage to tell the truth, to address problems early, the courage to challenge assumptions, the courage to make decisions before all the information is available. I think by empowering people to have that courage, that psychological safety,
Hmm.
can really change the environment, change the engagement, can change the communication style and how an organization reacts in a crisis situation.
And I want to link a couple of things that you said. You talked about courage, and earlier you said curiosity. That I think
Mhm.
it takes courage to be curious, right? To acknowledge that you don't know, right?
It's interesting because when we grew up, not knowing everything, we were curious as kids, wanting to learn. Having that curiosity as we became older, I think became biased in our understanding of things that, we can't do this or we can do this. So curiosity, I think, opens the person's mindset in what they are capable of doing. So being curious, I think, opens up a lot more avenues for an organization and for leadership.
I'm getting some journals that are going to be printed up for some of my work. They're going to be blank, but on the outside is going to say "Curiosity kills the crap," right? Because
I
I
love it.
really think we need that. Like we do, because it takes effort to be curious. We find something out we don't know. It might require us to do something different. Oh my goodness, right? So important. Jim, I know tell me a little bit about your books, just so that people can hear about it. We'll make sure that they're referred to in the program notes too.
Yeah, it's interesting. It came to a point in my life where someone on LinkedIn, a good friend of mine, said, Jim, I really appreciate everything you write on LinkedIn. They're very inspiring, very encouraging posts. And she mentioned you should write a book. And I kind of laughed. I'm thinking, well, I've been kind of writing for the last 15 years, but I've never done anything with it. But I found myself at a point in my life where I had nothing but time. And I wanted to provide that value and that guidance to others from my learning experiences. And so I first wrote a dissertation research on toxicity in workplaces, and not only how they affect the individual, but the overall organizational culture. And when that employee leaves to another organization, they're hyper vigilant. They're not their true selves. They're not showing up in a way that they're 100% because they're afraid of
Mhm.
what might happen if they speak up or, you know, make one small error. And so another thing I've learned is over time, there's an additional cost, not only to those future employers, but to the healthcare system. You
Mm.
know, they're checking out, they're having more stress in their life, they're trying to deal with other toxic uh, workplaces, and so they're seeking the advice of counselors or physicians. And again, taking that even a step further, there's that economic cost to the healthcare providers, the carriers, through insurance.
Yeah.
Where disability is now being supported because it's being documented as a mental health issue and no longer a workplace issue.
Oh,
And after that, I wanted to talk about leadership more, and so I wrote "Be More Human," and it was more about um, how you show up as a leader. You know, your presence, your intention, and that humanity that you show up with, how you care about people. You know, it's not about trying to have all the answers, but
mm,
you know, as I said earlier, more time learning how to ask better questions.
mm,
Um, you know, it's not about appearing certain, it's about creating clarity when certainty doesn't exist. Um, and then I wrote The Quiet Collapse, and that's again noticing the signals that early on are ignored, or they're delayed, then they become normalized, then they're tolerated, and then the event happens. And, you know, it's that cycle, and I'm trying to stop that cycle from happening so that leaders can ask more questions, to be more aware of their organizational environments, to create that safe place for employees to be able to speak up. Uh, and then talking to that other side of the quiet collapse on a personal level, I wrote "Be More Human," returning to your inner self.
mm,
And again, it talks about being that successful person on the outside, but creating those boundaries that will help support your own well being. I keep going back to the analogy of an airplane, and they always say when that oxygen mask drops, make sure to put it on yourself before helping
mm,
others.
mm, mm.
And it's so true with leadership. If you're not able to take care of your own self and your own well-being, how can you lead other people? And so it's, you know, it's all about being more human.
Wow. So the first book I'm gonna pick up, the first next book is Be More Human. That all sounds so important. You know, I'm seeing some themes in some of the guests I've had, and your return to inner self reminds me of this. I had someone on the other day about self leadership, and I think the similar process. Like how can you effectively lead other people if you're not self aware yourself and leading yourself? Very good. Okay.
Absolutely.
So, and also the other thing when you talked about the Quiet Collapse, another book, and I haven't had this person as a guest, and of course, at my tender age, I got a gap on his name, Michael Watkins, I think. I wrote a book called Predictable Surprises, where all those things built up, and if you look back, you'd seen the signs, but you ignored them. So, I like to leave our listeners with something to think about as they're driving or sitting in their couch or whatever. So, what are some things to kind of have this radar out for? So if I'm seeing or hearing these things, I really need to pay close attention, either for myself or for my organization, that are possible signals that there's a system about to collapse if we don't pay any attention. Are there maybe two or three things that are warning signs or warning signals for people to think about?
Thanks, David. You know, if I could leave the listeners with just one message,
Mm,
organizations do not collapse because people suddenly stop
mm,
caring.
mm,
Most failures
mm,
occur because good people adapt to unhealthy conditions slowly, enough that change becomes difficult to see, that normalization, that tolerance. Leadership is ultimately the responsibility to see what others cannot yet see,
mm.
and to address what other people hope will disappear, and to create environments where truth can surface before consequences do. The future belongs to leaders who are willing to confront reality early rather than explain it later. Create those safe environments where people can speak up, action those engagement surveys, action the feedback, have those difficult conversations.
Well, so what that's gonna the way I'm gonna interpret that, Jim, for me is I'm going to I won't say I'll do this every morning, but at least once a week, ask myself, is there anything that I am not paying attention to? Just to ask that question. I don't know what's gonna come up, right? But and then, if so, why and so what? Because that's
And
I
yeah,
think
and why am I delaying actioning that item? Like
yeah.
that sore back or, what am I doing? Am I doing anything to help that or relieve that?
And I have a hunch a lot of those things when I think about myself, it's about, at some level, fear of who knows what. Could be many different things, but, lots to think about. So I'm gonna make sure that, we post your website, the books that you're writing, all those kinds of things in the program notes. And I would like to thank you very much for your willingness to be a guest on Discover Fresh Perspectives here today, Jim.
It was my pleasure, David. I thank you and I hope you have a wonderful weekend.
So, David Gouthro, yes, discover fresh perspectives. There's very few guarantees in life, but one of them, at least in the short term, is that next week on Discover Fresh Perspectives, there'll be a fresh new guest with sharing some of their fresh new perspectives. Thank you very much for listening, and come on back next week. Subscribe now because on Fresh Perspectives, every episode is an opportunity to explore new horizons and redefine what's achievable.